Welcome to the Progress Texas Happy Hour.
Welcome to the Progress Texas Happy Hour, y'all. I'm podcasting director Chris Mosier.
I'm advocacy manager Reagan Stone.
The ongoing battle over private school vouchers continues in Texas. And to bring you up to speed, Governor Greg Abbott worked hard in the legislative offseason to primary and replace a bunch of the rural Texas Republican House reps who had in sessions past dared to defy the plans of Governor Abbott's billionaire benefactors to siphon off public school money over to private school families. And that effort by the governor to restack this vote was largely successful. As a result, private school vouchers appear to be closer to becoming the reality in Texas than they've ever been after decades of trying by Republicans.
But is the game over? We're seeing small Texas towns, a great many of whom likely voted for these new pro-voucher lawmakers, as well as Donald Trump, beginning to speak up against the voucher scam, perhaps realizing this plan is a lose-lose for small-town school districts. In some cases, they've been booing Republicans pushing for vouchers off of stages in those same little Texas towns.
As progressives, we believe very fundamentally that any plan to benefit private schools at the expense of public schools is a bad plan, a scam, in fact, as Reagan mentioned. But we wanted to explore exactly why that is. Texas Republicans continue scheming up and presenting ever more complicated iterations of the voucher scam, insisting that our public schools will be okay. But rather than just assuming that those Republicans are lying to Texas families, we wanted to understand what's really going on.
So we brought on three guests today. The nonprofit Every Texan has done heavy research into the threat of the private school vouchers pose to public schools. And we're proud to welcome Director of Economic Opportunity, Jaime Puente, and Director of Policy and Advocacy, Chandra Kring Villanueva, both of Every Texan today. Welcome, y'all.
We're also proud to welcome back to the pod a good friend of Progress Texas who's had a front row seat at the Capitol for all manner of Republican shenanigans for pushing a decade now. Democratic Austin State Representative Gina Hinojosa, welcome back.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Chandra, we know Every Texan well at Progress Texas, but give our listeners a quick overview of what you guys do and your overall mission.
Yeah, at Every Texan, we believe that social justice requires public policy. So we work in the interest of people to push people-centered policies at the Texas legislature. We are a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that's been around for about 40 years.
Very good. Jaime, do you want to add in there?
Yeah, one of the things I would add is that, we focus heavily on education precisely because it's one of the largest parts of our state budget. We know that Texans are working class Texans are the ones who pay the most in taxes in this state. And so we want to make sure that they're getting the most bang for their buck for public education.
So the idea for this talk was prompted by a neat online tool using Every Texan's nonpartisan data. That site, not directly associated with them, is don'tdefundmyschool.com. It's a simple and straightforward search engine that will show you how much your public school district stands to lose with the implementation of private school vouchers.
So just for fun, I plugged in the small town school district where I went to high school, which is Slayton ISD right outside of Lubbock. And the website says that Slayton schools stand to lose a bit over $500,000 in annual state funding, 9 teachers, over 10,000 library books, and an increase of the student-to-teacher ratio of about 5.3%. Of course, none of that is anywhere near good news for Slayton schools. So, Jaime, back to you. Tell us about this data and the research that was behind it.
So really what we did was we taken the weighted average daily attendance for each student's funding that goes to schools. And we estimated what the loss to a school district would be for their WADA funding at 1%, 3%, and 5%. And really what that means is that's the funding that schools use to operate their day-to-day classrooms. And so that goes into how they really make a class day function, and not so much what they might pay for a building, for example.
Chandra, can you also weigh in a little bit here?
Yeah, we wanted to really contextualize what the impacts were going to be on school districts. And even though our analysis found that school districts are at risk of losing, $2 billion or more, what this doesn't cover is how many kids who are already in private school and are going to be able to take advantage of this funding as well. So this is a huge outlay of funding that the legislature is putting forward that is not going to benefit our public education system that has to take every single kid. And what it's going to do is it's going to create another parallel branch of school funding. And we already have public schools and charter schools. And this is creating sort of a third rail. And it's just completely inefficient when you look at how large these sums of money are being taken out of the system that serves the vast majority of kids.
Yeah, and as you just said, Texans already have the school choice that we've already seen being argued by those on the right. They can, of course, send their kids to the school right down the street, the neighborhood public school. They can send them to a magnet school, an early preparatory school. And, as I turn over to Representative Hinojosa, do, these local numbers line up with what your fellow voucher opponents in the House see? And do you see any variation in that potential damage between the different plans being proposed by the Republicans at the ledge?
Well, the Republicans who are supporting vouchers are pretty clear. The vast majority, if not all of them, want a universal voucher, what they refer to as a universal voucher. It's what the governor says he wants. And this is just an opportunity for everyone, even very wealthy families who already have their kids in private schools. Everyone would get this voucher. So to Chandra's point, we're going to be funding the education of all these kids in private school and their private school tuition. And that's going to be an added pressure for Texas taxpayers.
Very good. Jaime, back to you. Tell us what every Texan sees kind of by example with other U.S. states that have adopted private school vouchers, in years past, as far as which families end up benefiting from them. We also hear that some of these states have ended up with really huge overall budget strains as a result. Tell us how all that works.
Right. So one of the things we see in other states, especially Florida, Arizona, Iowa, North Carolina, is that the first people who take advantage of these programs are the families who already have their children in a private school. They're the ones who have access and will be marketed to initially both by their school that they're in, but also by the programs that are established the way that our program would be required to do. And so you see initially, like the first take up is the students who are already in private schools who don't need that extra effort. And also, one of the other things that we see in Florida, they initially established the appropriation $400 million. It quickly rose to over $1 billion. And again, in Florida, right, another one of the big universal states, we've seen that the growth in voucher spending has risen by 11% since 2021, while public education spending has dropped by 11%.
Representative Hinojosa, what do you make of what we've been seeing lately with residents of these smaller school districts getting a lot more vocal against vouchers, even as so many of them have just replaced their former representatives with new ones who are now promising to pass vouchers?
What we saw in the districts where anti-voucher Republicans lost in the primaries was that they were being attacked not on their stance on vouchers. They were being attacked on border security. And this was really a bogus attack because all the Republicans voted the same on all of the border bills. So there was really no distinction. They were all of the same position as the governor. But that was the issue that resonated. When you look at the Republican Party platform, vouchers is not one of their priority issues on the platform. This issue is really being driven by the governor and his biggest donors, right? So we saw during the last election cycle that an out-of-state billionaire, Jeff Yaz, who made his money on private equity. That's his business. He made the largest political contribution in Texas history to Greg Abbott. I think at this point it's $12 million that he's given to Greg Abbott. And these are the people who are pushing the privatization of our public schools. To Jaime's earlier point, public education is a large section of our state budget. Last time I checked, it was second only to healthcare. Now, that money is making these profiteers salivate, right? They want access to the money that should be going to our public schools for all sorts of reasons, to do private school land deals, for all the contracts associated with them. There is even a belief that we shouldn't have public schools. Rather, you should have to finance your K through 12 education if it's important enough to you, just like people have to do for college. That is also a big driver. Vouchers, right? That's not one they talk about now because that's not a popular position, but definitely the profiteers are seeing dollar signs when they see our neighborhood public schools. So now people are waking up to it. They're weighing in, even though my position is well known. I'm anti-voucher. People are calling my office to make sure, but we are having a lot of people contact legislators, and to the point where I'm hearing legislators are not being responsive, not answering their phones because there's so much pressure that is coming from real Texans who support their neighborhood public schools.
Yeah, not those billionaires.
Right.
I would weigh in that anybody listening to this who's tried to reach out to their representatives at the ledge and have not gotten an answer, to keep on trying. Those people are there to be responsive to what you need. Try the phone, try the email, just keep on hitting it. Do not take silence for an answer here. Rep. Hinojosa, I had one more thing kind of along that line to ask you about, which is there's this undercurrent of the conversation on the progressive side about this longstanding desire to basically funnel public money into religious schools. Like there's a specific religious angle here for parochial schools. Is there anything you can say about that in terms of how much influence that line of thinking has over the current set of Republicans trying to get this through?
Definitely. The Catholic Church, for instance, is one example of a religion that is pushing this voucher. The way I see it is these Catholic churches have been, and their schools have been really hurt by charter schools, right? That is the second lane of public education dollars that we have established, that we fund. And people see charter schools oftentimes as free private schools because the charter schools don't by law have to take all kids like your neighborhood schools do. So people will choose a charter school when they might have otherwise chosen a private school, and the private schools are hurting as a result. So definitely the Catholic Church is a driver, but I have also heard in communities during election time, I was traveling around the state helping Democrats who were running for office, and we were hearing stories of churches with plans to open up private schools if and when vouchers pass so they can get access to those dollars.
Very interesting. Chandra, back over to you. All of this, as we've talked about, Reagan mentioned this a second ago, and this is the very common and fairly common sense on its face sort of argument that you'll hear just from citizens, not necessarily politicians, but citizens who have begun to be sympathetic to these propositions that are coming from the Republican side. Typically, it's framed as school choice, given more options to families who might not be satisfied with the public school down the street. On its face, that seems like a pretty good idea. It's easy to see where some parents would buy into that line of reasoning. Tell us why the idea of increased choice in schools is a falsehood here.
Yeah, well, what we like to say is that these bills provide no chance at choice. These bills do not create choice for families. These private schools do not have to accept kids. They can discriminate for any reason. They don't have to accept you if they don't like your religion, your sexuality, your past behavior, your academic marks. Getting accepted into some of these higher ranking private schools can be a full-time job in and of itself for the parents. these schools do not have to take your kids. And if these schools do take your kids, the tuition gap is often something that's insurmountable for most families. The, very best private schools in the state cost $25,000, $35,000 a year. A lot of private schools also don't offer K through 12, especially a lot of the parochial religious schools. They may have elementary, they may just go up to 6th or 8th grade. Very rarely do they have high school, or not as common as is required by, public school districts. So this is not creating any new opportunities for families who did not have access to these schools beforehand. They are not going to be able to pay the full tuition, and they are not going to get accepted. What's more likely to happen is we'll see the growth of what I like to call University of Phoenix elementary schools, where subpar schools are going to show up in a storefront near you, charging what just happens to be the voucher amount as a tuition, billing themselves as a private school, selling themselves to parents as a better option, but not providing a higher quality education and just siphoning those dollars into their own pockets. And that's what the reality is going to be of these types of programs.
Chandra, is it fair to say that, in that situation where you have these fly-by-night operators popping up, a big part of the conversation here has been the lack of oversight that private schools have? I mean, is it likely that a strip mall elementary school is going to be able to do so without anybody even really watching what they're doing? Is that a possibility here?
It absolutely is, because homeschools are seen as private schools. They always talk about how you have to be accredited by the different private school associations, but then they talk about micro schools and private or homeschooling. And so you can get somebody, just like you see these storefront churches that pop up where just somebody ordains themselves a minister one day, sets up a little church, and we'll see that with these micro schools and educational pods and things like that, where somebody will be offering this and people will take it. And I don't think that there's going to be strong enough regulation to prevent this sort of creation of things to happen.
It really reminds me of Trump University, which will remind everyone that it was a fraudulent institution, one of his many bankruptcies.
San Antonio listeners, join us in the Alamo City on Tuesday, May 6th for the first time since 2017 for a live podcast taping and fun get-together with like-minded progressives. You'll have the chance to visit with candidates, office holders, and activists, grab a beverage, share stories, and celebrate progress in Texas, which doesn't happen without you. During our happy hour and live podcast recording, come meet people doing good work to push progress forward in Texas. You can sponsor the event and this podcast and RSVP early with the link in the show notes, and we hope to see you there.
Back to you, Representative Hinojosa. The classic view of politics is the art of compromise, right? Which is harder to come by given the current party dynamics at the Capitol. In your view, is there any middle ground here? Any point at which Democrats would accept a voucher program, or is it simply a no-go?
It is a no-go, but let me tell you what I would accept. And that's to let Texans vote on whether or not they want vouchers. Other states in this country get to vote. Their citizens get to have a say on whether we're going to dramatically change the kind of education that our kids get in the state. Why can't Texans also get that right? So I would support a measure to allow Texans an opportunity to vote on taxpayer-funded vouchers.
And that would be a constitutional amendment, or rather, you can correct me if I'm wrong there.
So I don't think it has to be a constitutional amendment. It turns out that in 1987, we had a statewide referendum on SBOE elections, whether or not Texans should be able to vote on the State Board of Education membership. And Texans said, yes, turns out I want to vote about who my State Board of Education member is going to be. Now, the difference between Texas and other states is we don't have a voter-initiated referendum process, right? But the legislature can pass a bill that says, we're going to have a vote on this issue. And that's what I think should happen.
I mean, that would come in handy for so many different issue areas. I mean, reproductive justice pops to mind as something that they dare not put on a ballot in front of the Texas voters, because I think they would be finding out, very different from what they've been driving at themselves without that influence.
On that point, this issue is really, I think, perfectly made for a statewide vote because there aren't clear partisan lines. I work very, very closely to try to kill this voucher effort with MAGA Republican moms, for instance, right? And so I think a lot of legislators don't really know where their districts are. Again, their primary elections were not about this issue. So it really would be in legislators' best interest to say, hey, you know what? This is a hard issue in our district. Let's hear what you have to say. Let's give it to the voters.
Might be too much democracy. I've got one I want to kick towards Jaime here, and Chandra, if you want to weigh in, you can as well. Also something we hear back from average citizens who have begun to warm up to the idea of school vouchers is the fact that they get some money back. That it's money. Well, I paid this money into the tax pool. I want my money to go to my kid's school, but it's only X amount of money, which is in most cases not going to cover the full tuition of an actual well-established private school or parochial school. Whereas, as we talked about before, we're going to see some fly-by-night operators pop up just to try to grab that money. With the current plans that are being floated out there, what's the typical gap going to be for the average family that thinks that they'll be able to actually use this voucher kind of rebate to make private school affordable for them when it wasn't before?
I think that depends. It depends upon whether or not, like Chandra said, they are in elementary school, whether or not they're in middle school or high school, because, even the more moderate high school is about $20,000 on the lower end. If a parent gets $10,000 and your tuition annually is $20,000, but you also have to pay for sports, you also have to pay for the other extracurriculars, books, uniforms, transportation, right? There are a lot of other expenses that go into educating a student that is not accounted for in this particular voucher. And, one of the things that I would say to someone who's like, oh, maybe I could take this voucher and it would be good for me. It's like, okay, maybe, but very often what you are going to get in a voucher is nowhere near the quality and the value that you would get from a public education system, from your public high school, from your public elementary. Individually, we'll never be able to afford the kind of education that somebody like a Ted Cruz or a Jeff Bezos or an Elon Musk can afford for their child, right? But together we can call on our state to say, we want you to invest in us with our tax dollars.
Chandra, as you add in here, I kind of want to hear your idea on how public schools are such a great equalizer in some way too.
Yeah, definitely. The one thing I kind of want to add on to Jaime first, though, is, when people say that, well, they're paying their tax dollars, they should be able to take them where they want. Most families are not paying $10,000 a year in property taxes to their schools. And if you have more than one kid, like that's definitely, most people aren't paying $20,000, $30,000 a year. But our public schools are the great equalizer. They have to take everyone. You get to be experienced and exposure to people who come from different backgrounds, different incomes, different religions, different cultures. And when you have private schools, you often see segregation on several different lines, whether it be religious, economic, or racial. And that's really how vouchers came to be in this country. They were something that was invented after the Brown versus Board of Education ruling that said that we had to integrate schools. And so this was a way to create an escape valve for white families to get out of integrated schools. And that's when we saw really the growth of private schools in the state of Texas, especially these religious private schools. So this really is, it's about segregation and it's about keeping people apart instead of bringing people together. And then too, if you're only going to take, the highest performing students, the ones with the most involved parents, what you're going to be left behind with is the kids with the greatest needs. You're going to have the kids that nobody else wants to take because either they have learning disabilities, physical disabilities, behavioral issues, unstable family lives. And then that's what our public system then is going to have to be working with, is just the hardest to teach kids. And all of the resources are going to be given to the wealthiest in our communities to pay for an option that they've already been utilizing before the voucher started. So our schools are going to be left with this really, really great expense to try to educate all of the kids that have the greatest needs. And that's not good for the public system. That's not good for those kids there. And it's just going to make the challenges that we're seeing in public education even worse.
Rep Hinojosa, let's have you one more here, kind of along that same line. Smaller town schools like the one that I attended high school, I was talking about at the top of this, very much, those schools are the major employers of those cities. There's the Friday night lights, there's, school sports. It's super central to the community. It's difficult for me to imagine that people who have such a high priority for those schools as part of their identity would even be thinking about something that would undercut that. What do you say to a person living in that type of a community who might be thinking about, or might be being persuaded by this argument towards private school vouchers?
Well, I haven't really come across many of those people. The people we're hearing from are constituents in those small communities. They reach out to me because I'm on the public education committee, and they are adamantly opposed to vouchers. There has been an effort by the right and people exploiting any kind of issues that come up in our public schools to really demonize our neighborhood public schools and our teachers.
Right.
And so for people who are maybe not in our public schools, for people who are consuming a lot of their media online, they may have bought into that narrative. So my experience, and this is polling shows this too, it's that when people are in public school, when they have a direct connection to public schools, they feel good about their schools. It's the people who don't have that connection that buy the political rhetoric that you hear on Fox News about how our schools are too woke or that there's pornography in the library, and on and on and on. Yeah, our experience is the PTA moms, the football coaches in those small towns, the teachers in those towns, they're with us on this issue. And the challenge is courage. Let me just be blunt. There is a crisis of courage in politics right now, especially after the governor went after all these Republicans who stood their ground and voted in favor of their neighborhood public schools and against vouchers. Even though he didn't run against them on that, he poured in a lot of money to get them beat. And that's scary, right? There's some Republican members who will stand up to it and have said they're going to stand up to it. There are others who probably need more encouragement from their constituents to do the right thing. And at the same time, then those constituents, those voters need to show up during election time. You all know our primaries are not very well used, right? Not enough voters show up to vote in primaries. And so it will happen again that members will lose their primary election if teachers, parents, community who support our public schools don't turn out to vote. That's the fear.
So a lot of maybe one-term representatives perhaps here in our near future. We won't give them any shout outs right now, but I kind of, as we come towards our end here, I want to see if there's any shout outs from our guests. And I'll start off by saying that a lot of great work coming out, of course, of Every Texan, but also another ally, Raise Your Hand. And there are fantastic superintendents and school district employees and teachers that are standing up, of course, parents as well. One from my hometown, Alpine ISD superintendent, has been traveling around the state, coming to Austin, testifying. Dr. Michelle Reinhart, a fantastic friend. Representative Hinojosa, is there anyone, partners, friends, allies, anybody you want to shout out on the podcast today?
Austin PTA has been amazing. And the advocacy work that they do at the Capitol, because this is their home, really is essential. My own school board member, Lynn Boswell, has just been a powerhouse on this issue. She has organized across the state. She's helped us tremendously on this issue. I have my kind of team that really of constituents, of just people who know so much that I go to, and I wouldn't be able to do this work without them. Some of them would rather remain anonymous, but definitely this is a team effort. And last time, the only reason we were able to beat vouchers is because everybody played their part. And all across the state, everybody played their part. So that needs to happen again. And we need to double down because this time it's going to be a little bit harder.
Chandra, as we begin to close down, any closing thoughts from you?
Yeah, I mean, I think I also just want to give a shout out to the everyday people of Texas who are showing up in their communities. We see a lot in Austin. We have big rallies in Austin. But when these events are happening in people's home district offices and people are taking time out of their busy lives, spending their Saturdays, their evenings, going to these town halls and voicing, the issue about that they care about, it's really inspiring and it's really great to see. Living in Austin, being in Austin, like we see a lot at the Capitol and we have a lot of access to our elected officials in a way that a lot of people across the state don't. So I just, shout out to everyone who's showing up to town halls. I just really encourage people to get involved in their local communities. You don't have to come to Austin. You can go to the district office. You can go to their town halls. But it's just so important for all of us now to actually be engaged in these political discussions and not just think like, oh, that happens in Austin. That doesn't affect my life. It affects everybody in Texas.
Jaime, close us out, your final thoughts and any shout outs.
Yeah, one of the things, I always like to talk about this subject as, public education is a tie that binds us all together as Texans and Americans. And, we've heard that from Rep. Hinojosa, we've heard that from Chandra. And I want to shout out like Senator Nichols. He was the lone Republican in the Senate to vote against SB 2. And in his, for his vote, he submitted a statement to the Senate Journal that really described, exactly what we're talking about from his East Texas perspective. And so, I want to shout out Senator Nichols for, having the courage, as Rep. Hinojosa said, to, represent his community. But I would be remiss to not also shout out Chloe Sykes, my partner over at IDRA, who we co-lead the Texas Legislative Education Equity Coalition, which is on the front lines fighting both against vouchers, but for public education.
Can I redo my shout out?
Why don't you just add a second shout out? Is that okay?
Okay. I got to add another shout out to Daphne Hoffaker with Austin PTAs. And I got to tell this little itty bitty story. She was testifying to the Public Education Committee, and Brian Harrison was sitting on the dais and he kept railing. He's very vocal on social media. He kept yelling about government schools this, government schools that. And she said, "Hey, Representative Harrison, I got news for you. You're the government. So, Mr. Government, let me tell you." And the title stuck. And so now at the Capitol, people refer to him as Mr. Government.
I love it. I love it.
Yes. Wonderful.
Man, if there ever was a guy who needs a negative nickname, it's that guy. We hope this conversation has brought a greater degree of detail and understanding about why private school vouchers remain something to be opposed by all Texans, regardless of their party. Jaime Puente and Chandra Kring Villanueva of Every Texan, thank you both so much for your input today. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
And State Representative Gina Hinojosa, always a pleasure. And thanks so much for taking time to talk with us today.
Thanks for doing this. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. As we close, thank you, dear listeners. You're already supporting our mission by following and listening to our podcast, but we invite you to take your activism one step further and help us keep doing what we do by becoming a regular monthly contributor at progresstexas.org/donate. Even small regular donations add up significantly for us, and no amount is too small. We want to thank Darby Hamilton, Angela Kaiser, and Nicole Ramirez. All three have recently joined the team. We appreciate it, and we can't do it without you. Thanks again for the support, everybody, and we'll see you next time.